And these are the Twinmotion essentials that I would have learned first. I will help you turn your 3D models in Twinmotion from this to this. In this video, I will go over the basics of the user interface, how to explore the different assets, materials, lighting, and even how to have amazing rendering outputs and what settings to use. In addition, we will be learning about helpful workflows, what I use to be more efficient and more effective, as well as some bonus tips. At the end of the video, I will go over how to download Twinmotion. It's somewhat of a unique process, so if you haven't downloaded it, stay until the end, and I will also go over the specs and the computer requirements that Twinmotion requires. Now, this first step will save you a whole lot of time. When you're importing your model from either Rhino, Revit, or SketchUp, you can import it as a geometry or a direct link. Now, I highly recommend downloading the Datasmith file, which I will leave a link down below, which is a plugin that gives you the ability to have your Rhino file saved and directly import that into your Twinmotion file. It'll automatically update every time you save, and you have the ability to keep the hierarchy of the layers, collapse by material, or just collapse the whole model, which makes it a very small file size. And so kind of going in that a little bit more, when it collapses by material, everything in that layer or with the same material color in your 3D model is going to be grouped together. So when you start placing materials in Twinmotion, it's going to do that all together. You can't individually place them. If you keep the hierarchy of the layers from your 3D model, you'll most likely be able to do each individual element as a different material. And in some instances, I recommend exploding different layers if you have a wall that's going to have multiple textures. Now, if you collapse the whole model together, the only benefit to this is really having one cohesive model that's very small in file size. Now, to find the navigation, you go to the eyeball, click, go to the bottom and show navigation. You'll pan and move around using your mouse, but then using the arrow keys, you can move up and down, side to side. And then using the numbers 1 through 6, you'll be getting different speeds. 1 being the inspect speed, all the way up to fly. And this is how it looks in action. So right now, 1 and 2 are barely noticeable, but as you start to move and progress, you can start to see a huge difference. Now, 6 is way too much, and I'd say 2 is probably too low and too slow for me. I usually stay around 4 or 5, depending on the model size. And if I'm really getting and focusing on the details, I might use 3. Now, within Twinmotion, you can't do a lot of modeling, but you can move, rotate, and scale the different objects that you imported. You can also adjust, and the shortcuts for those, move is 7, 8 is rotate, and 9 is scale. So those are just some quick tips and tricks. And another way to find out the other shortcuts within Twinmotion is to go to help and then go down to shortcuts, and there's a whole document of all the shortcuts. Or sometimes you just hover over the icon and it'll give you a shortcut right there. Now, along with being able to show the navigation, if you go into the eyeball, you can change the sun direction, you can rotate the time of day, you can take a screenshot, you can switch between pedestrian and drone mode. So this gives you the ability to fly around as you were like a drone, typical with most 3D softwares. But what is really nice is the pedestrian mode, which gives you the ability to walk around your model at eye level, giving you the ability to have the perfect perspective from a street view or an interior. And it also, in Twinmotion, you have the ability to do VR, and also it gives you different views. So you get the side elevations, the floor plan, and you can use the clipping plane to give you section perspectives that are all potentially rendered. So on the bottom left of the screen, you can see it says library. You open that up, you can click on the materials icon. To get a material onto a surface, you just simply drag it and drop it where you want it. Now, as you're seeing right now, it's dragging and populating the whole model, every single layer that's a part of that building. And the reason is, default setting is to replace that material. So if you haven't done any material work or divided the layers by different materials in your 3D modeling software, everything will end up being the same material. One way you can change that is do apply by selection. So if you click on element inside of your Twinmotion model, it'll just apply to there. But what I use most effectively is apply to object, and this gives you the ability to drag and drop and change the material for individual objects. But the next biggest thing is to fix the UV. This is one of the first things I do and change it from object UV to cubic. And the reason is, a lot of times in Rhino specifically, but the other ones, the UV mapping is off, and so it won't look right. And if you get the cubic UV mapping, it'll look like it should. If you're using something that's like a cylinder or a sphere, then you can use those specific UV maps, but they're very rare, so it's there if you need it, but don't use those for any other circumstances. Now, when you start to use a material on multiple objects, you can see that there are 2 check marks on the upper left corner of that material. And if there's only one, that means it's only been used on one object. And if there's none, it hasn't been used yet, but it's still kind of in that directory. One of the things I learned really fast and overpopulated my material bank was because I started dragging the same material each time from the library onto the model. And a much simpler way and easier way to do it is, once you've dragged it over once, it'll populate inside the material bank and you drag it from there. So then you don't have like 10 duplicates, which essentially is just a waste. And now if you click on one of the materials and open the properties panel on the right side, it gives you the ability to change the different settings, mess with the grudge, which kind of gives it more of an aged look. And then also the ability to add mapping and different textures to each level of the surface to give it more of a realistic feel. Now, something that's unique in Twinmotion is, if you have a surface, you can only see it from one side. And so sometimes you have to adjust the UV direction inside your 3D modeling software because you can't see the material on the other side. It looks invisible from one side, but you can see it from the other. But one way to fix that is turning on the 2-sided material. Now, as you see, you turn it on, when you go to the bottom, it's the material's on both sides. And this is an easy solution to fix that. Twinmotion has a vast library of different materials. It really gives you the ability to just test out many different options. And if you're looking to override a certain material, let's say all these walls that were concrete, you want to make them wood, all you have to do is drag in that wood over top the concrete in the materials bank. It'll override all the materials that were selected. And this is an easy way and a fast way to quickly test different options and styles inside a space without having to individually mark each wall. Next, I'll show you how to import people. Simply just drag the person or the group into the scene. One way to do this very fast and get different results is click on it in the library, but then click the different places inside your scene, and it'll give you different groups of people, so it's not the same repetitive style. And if you want to edit a specific person inside a group, what you have to do is double click on that person, and you have the ability to change their animation, change their pose, and there's a good diverse amount of these, so you can cover a lot of different scenarios. And you can also change their clothes. So, I mean, it's a really cool feature. Now, I've added people in Photoshop before, and a lot of times it's using 2D cutouts. But this is something that is very similar in Twinmotion. You have the ability to use cutouts and place them inside your model. But when you move around, these cutouts still look like they're in perspective, so it doesn't have any negative effects. Twinmotion also has a very versatile and deep vehicle library. And when you go into it, you're able to change the color of the cars and other vehicles, but you can also go into the material layer and car paint folder, and it gives you a ton more options. And if you thought it couldn't get any better, let's go check out Twinmotion's objects. Now, it's divided into different categories. If you go into the home category, it actually breaks it up into different rooms. So everything you need is kind of grouped in a way that is very useful, so you kind of know what can go together. They also have things that are better for a city, and it helps having a category to place these objects into so that you're not kind of making things out of place. But when you do import an object, you have the ability to move them around just like you would anything else. The easiest way to kind of get the object onto the floor plane is using the Move with Collision tool. And so it stops moving when it collides with another object or surface. Now, one thing I definitely hesitate to show you is this next tool, which is Move by Gravity. It just drops and kind of uses gravity to put it in its place. And I hesitate to recommend using the collision or the gravity tool, because I found that you can't undo or at least go back to their original placement without restarting. And so be very careful. If anything, use the collision tool, because at least you can get it on the ground plane and not have it hovering or inside the ground. But I haven't found a great use for the gravity tool, at least for placing furniture and more stagnant objects. But when you do place objects like the furniture, you have the ability to manipulate them a little bit. If you go into their properties, you can mess with their materials, and sometimes they're broken into groups. So there's different objects within a placed object that you can manipulate and move around. If you want to duplicate or copy something, all you have to do is, when you're moving it, hold shift and it will duplicate either by instance or copying it. And as you can see here, when you're placing these bushes, when you copy it or do an instance, you can do a certain number of copies. So you can do a whole line without having to place them individually, which is nice. But this next tool is even better than that, because you're able to paint the vegetation, which is even faster. You can drag and drop the bushes, the plants, anything in the vegetation tab that you want to populate, and then you use the density of this brush to paint it around the areas you want. This is extremely helpful when you are trying to fill in a background with trees and you don't want to spend or take the time to individually place those trees. When you do click on one of the painted vegetation selection, it selects everything at once. So you're able to hide it all together without selecting everything individually, because sometimes these do take up a lot of space and then slow down your computer. But as you can see, my layers are a little bit unorganized. So what we're gonna do is start creating some sub-containers. And what this does is you can start to use them as folders and grouping things together. But one of the benefits is to just give you the ability to be organized. And then you can set a certain folder to an active container. So anything you start to add afterwards will go directly to that container. So this stove or this cooker and the fridge, I added those two objects after I set the objects folder to active. And so everything kind of stays organized that way. Just remember to switch the active containers when you start doing something different, because I've forgotten that and then it gets to be a mess to do later. So just stay accountable and up to date with that. Now you can see I didn't add any doors. Everything is just openings in my 3D model. And the reason I did that is because Twinmotion has this really cool feature where you can add doors, and it can sense, as you see here, an opening, and it fits the door that you dragged and dropped into that opening, whether it's a sliding door or a normal door. And so when you go into pedestrian mode and you start to walk, the door is open for you, which is really cool. And it's especially helpful when you start to do a walkthrough. And as you see here, sometimes you accidentally fall off the map, and that is a problem with the pedestrian mode, because if you walk off, you're just gonna fall forever. So one way to get back is go into your objects in your layers and then click on something and zoom select, and that'll get you kind of back on your feet. And another thing you could do is, if you have a rendered view already set up, you just go to the media tab, double click that view, and it'll kind of get you set back in that perspective, which is really nice. So when you're ever editing a rendering view and you start to move it around, all you have to do is double click and it sets that frame up right away. One of my helpful workflow tips is to keep a good layer structure. And not only does this mean keeping things in folders, but turning off layers that might be bogging down your model, like lighting, trees, and larger geometry items. Another thing I recommend to keep the speed fast and the file size low is starting by applying materials first, then doing objects, trees, and then finally ending with lighting and adjusting the rendering settings. This is kind of what I found to be the most effective way, and you start to get slower and slower as you add these up. The reason this is so effective is a lot of the stuff you're doing with materials and objects takes a lot more time and is a lot more noticeable. So doing this first and having a very fast file is the most important, rather than doing it after you've included trees and lighting. Now, what sets Twinmotion apart from a lot of the other rendering softwares is the library of assets and materials that it has. In addition to the objects and the materials I've already shown you and gone through, there is a whole different section of megascans which are included within Twinmotion, and these are more realistic elements that can be used as 3D assets and materials. And so let's go through those real quick. You can see that people have modeled these, and actually it's made like a whole collective library. The materials are a lot more detailed, and you can see that things like metal have categories within categories, just giving some more specific context and realism to the project. If you're using Twinmotion's default skies, you have a very good range of possibilities, and you're able to adjust the slider from day and night within Twinmotion, which is very nice. But if you want an alternative and probably a higher quality option, you need to use HDRI skies, and they have these inside Twinmotion. All you have to do is go to their environments. They have skies, they have indoor lighting situations, they have outdoor lighting environments, so this gives like context as well as the sky. And then they have those studio lighting environments more for products and stuff like that, not as much architecture. And then another thing in Twinmotion is the Sketchfab library, and these are all things that normal everyday people have created and just been importing into this forum basically called Sketchfab. Now let's hop into these tools. You're able to do section cuts, section perspectives, and stuff like that using this section cube, which gives you a box that you can manipulate any which way, which gives you some really cool options. It's a little bit different than the clipping tool that we used earlier because that's only in one direction at a time, but this one gives you the possibility to do like a double section because you can add multiple section cubes. One way to improve the reflections and the quality look in the final product of your glass is to use one of these box reflection probes. All you have to do is drag it in. You can adjust the scale of it for the coverage on the glass. You can see how much of a difference and how much more realistic it makes it. You can also add notes, LED walls, and also use rotator animations to do things like doors and other carousel-like objects. Now, what you've been waiting for, lighting, it's so much different than some of the other rendering softwares. Enscape, you kind of do your lighting within Rhino and SketchUp. With Lumion, you have to place them manually, kind of like this. It's so much easier when you're able to place an individual light and then be able to copy it. Twinmotion lighting is somewhat similar to Lumion. I like Twinmotion's realistic light a little bit better than I do with Lumion. As you can see, you can adjust a lot of these settings, the intensity and the length of it. I know from experience using Enscape, there are some limitations on the sizes of the lights you use, and they don't have a wide selection of different kinds of lights. They have like the generic 4 or 5 different types. In Twinmotion, they have IES lights, neon lights, omni lights, just a larger range to choose from, and it's much more effective. So if you were to do something like a spotlight and you already have one placed, you can start to use the copy and do multiple at a time so you're not placing them individually. This also makes it easy to line them up, and then you copy one side to the other, and it's very easy, and it gives very consistent lighting. And then if you select all of them together in the layers panel, you can adjust every light together as one, so you don't have to adjust each one individually, which is super nice and makes your workflow a lot faster. There's so many different things that come together with Twinmotion. If you have the Quixel bridge, which you can download, it gives you another extension for more assets, more materials, brushes, decals, and imperfections. So let's check out some of the surfaces and materials that you can get from this bridge library. You can just see the detail and the realism in these quality materials. These PBR materials have a lot of just depth to it. They have different layers, and they all have the different maps that are required to give depth, the texture, and the imperfections of those materials. And you can adjust those here in the download settings. I typically use the normal, the AO, the albedo, the displacement, and the roughness textures. I found Twinmotion accommodates those the best. they don't really have a lot of spaces for anything else. So that is why I use those because I can't really use anything else in Twinmotion. And then you download those from there and it'll go to a folder on your desktop. And then later in the video, I'll show you how you can get this material placed into your Twinmotion model. Quixel Bridge library has a lot more than just materials. You can find these historic assets and very detailed models of a lot of different things. They also have an archviz collection, which I know you guys were probably very interested in, which is just another database of more materials that we haven't even experienced yet. If you look at these polished marbles, just these high-end materials that can be placed. So now we're going to create a custom material of whatever material you chose from that Quixel Bridge library or anything else, I guess. So what you're going to do is just create a new material. So first we're going to go into the details and upload the albedo texture, which is the first mapping. We're going to go next to the roughness and include the texture. So this will be the roughness texture. Pretty self-explanatory. And then we're going to go to the normal map, import that. And these are all giving depth and shadow and context to this material map, as you can see there. So now we're going to start to manipulate the rendering framework and settings. Now I'm kind of choosing a different HDR sky. Right now I just have a basic sky, but I want to choose something with a little bit more contrast and lighting. So I want to edit the sky right now inside this rendering. The one I have now is too basic and I want to find one with a little bit more contrast. So I'm going to go into a low sky. Now if you go to Polyhaven, they have a whole library of additional HDR skies that can use, very high quality and super easy to download, and then you just import those through Twinmotion. Now another tool that is very useful for probably larger projects, not this residential house that I'm currently working on, it's the populate tool. And we kind of went over it with vegetation, but you can use it for people and objects to make a character path. You can change the width and the density. You can make them walking or standing still, giving you the ability to manipulate the different type of people inside of this path. The direction they go, you can add different points, and once you've placed a point, you can still adjust it, delete it, or move it around and add more. So it's a very cool tool just to use for probably videos. It's not going to be effective in a rendering because everything is a still image if you're in VR or doing a walkthrough. Now another way to use the populate tool is to use the urban setting for site context. You determine a location and it will place all the buildings from OpenStreetMaps into the context. Here's a quick montage of me just adding more assets, materials, and context to fill up the render for the final output. Feel free to skip this if you want to see the rendering settings afterwards. Otherwise, enjoy. first I'm going to go into the environment and start adjusting the exposure and the sun intensity. I feel like sometimes having the auto exposure doesn't give you as realistic of a feel as you want. So sometimes I turn it off. It can be beneficial on occasion, just depending on the type of sky you choose. But what I do then, because it makes it very dark without the auto exposure, is I adjust the sun settings. I also go into the exposure and turn the exposure up. Sometimes it gets a little too high in exposure, so you just gotta be careful with the contrast, the saturation, and all these settings are very subtle. I usually turn down the saturation a little bit and the contrast down a little bit as well. Sometimes it's just a little bit too strong and powerful, especially with a lot of trees and colorful objects, but I turn the exposure up to about 4. I find it gives a good realistic feel, not too bright, but a good contrast between shadow and light. Now you can change the weather to raining or snowing depending on the season, so you just mess with the sliders. These can be good for different moods and different locations that you might be doing your renderings in. In terms of intensity of the sky, you don't want it to be super dark because that's not realistic, especially since this isn't a night render. But I'm finding that this is a little bit not what I wanted. I'm gonna go and change my HDR sky once again. I just found this wasn't really going well with the lighting that I wanted. So now we get some more natural light, brightening it up a little bit. I think the mood of this image is a little better. I made it fall, so you can see the trees have changed color. When I brought that sky in, it was very bright, so I'm gonna go back and adjust the exposure to a little under 4, I think is a good fit. You can adjust the depth of field, and basically this blurs things out at a certain distance that aren't as important. You can also turn on different camera effects. I always turn on parallelism. It lines up everything vertically, so it's very clean and the perspectives look very good. Turning shadows on is important, but you don't want to make the shadow bias too strong, otherwise shadows aren't as detailed. You can also do color gradients that are presets, kind of like you would do in Photoshop. I don't necessarily like these unless you're going for a certain kind of mood or style. You can also turn on filters, and if you want like a clay model render, it is also possible to do that in Twinmotion. So to do a render, you basically just click the plus sign and it adds a rendering. You can click the refresh circle to refresh the rendering if you end up moving it, and you double click to go to that view frame if you're out of that perspective. I think for the rendering perspectives, it's very important to use a grid. The rule of thirds is important in order to frame your renders, but also the golden ratio. Just consider the priority views that you want to include, the placement of people and vehicles, that you don't want certain things to be the priority of your focus. Now there's not as much to adjust for this interior render. I'm pretty good with the lighting, but I think it still needs to be adjusted a little bit. I'm gonna turn the auto exposure off and use the normal exposure. I think that can kind of give a better effect for those lights that we added inside. You kind of lose that element of the lighting you put in Twinmotion if you start using the auto exposure. And if you're lazy, I guess that's one reason to do auto exposure, just a quick trick. But other than that, just some small adjustments I was making. And really the lighting is just about getting the light from the right side, from the exterior, and kind of getting that to show within the space. I think I didn't do that super well, and so one way I could increase that lighting is by adding a rectangle light or something outside the frame that shines in, bringing in lighting from the right. Other than that, you can fake light in different ways, but that's for another video that's a little bit more detailed. This is just a beginner's tutorial. And now to output it, you can adjust it all the way to 16K, and then it gives you the ability to adjust the settings from there. So all you have to do is click the export button. There are several ways you can export in Twinmotion. You can do photos, videos, panorama frames, presentations. You can do a panorama set, which is multiple panoramas, and you can do a presentation. And I've done a panorama set actually, and basically it creates like a whole model based on panoramic views that you can go from panoramic shot to panoramic shot and basically get a full 3D perspective of that model. Very few settings you have to adjust. You just turn it on whatever level quality you want it to be. Obviously I'm going to do high for this instance, but you can turn on max lighting, but you can export it as a PNG, JPEG, and EXR. And what you do is click the plus sign and select the 2 views that you want. And from there, all you have to do is start the export and let Twinmotion do the rest. I found it's pretty fast and doesn't take a lot of time to generate these outputs. Unless you're doing path tracer, then it'll get a little bit more detailed, and it also depends on the specs of your computer. One of my favorite ways to work smarter, not harder, is finding the best views and perspectives first before I do anything else. And this is because I'm able to kind of frame everything that I'm going to do based on these images. If I have an outdoor perspective showing only part of the exterior, I only have to add objects to that part of the model and not bog down the rest of it because it's never going to be shown or seen. So let's kind of go into how to download Twinmotion, but also what Twinmotion requires when it comes to computer hardware and specs and speed. Now first we'll be going over the system requirements for Twinmotion. So there's some minimum requirements that are needed to meet. In order to run Twinmotion, download Twinmotion, it just needs a certain size requirement because it is a very big data hog. And here are some of the high-end requirements to get the maximum out of Twinmotion. And if you want to use path tracer, you have to have a certain graphics card and amount of storage to be able to do that. With my computer, I'm not able to do path tracer, but with my PC, I have enough of the right equipment to do path tracer, and it just changes the quality of the images. Now the next step is to go to Epic Games website and create an account. The next step is to download Epic Games. And then once that has worked, you open it up and now you can have the Epic Games launcher. The next step is Google Twinmotion and open that up. And we're gonna go over how to download Twinmotion. So to get the latest version, you'll go to their website and it offers a free trial, an educational license, and a commercial license. The first 2 can't be used for commercial projects, but are completely free, unlimited. There's no time restriction or anything like that. You get the same results except with the free version. I think you can only go up to 2K as the quality, but that's still very good. It takes about 15 minutes to download depending on your computer and is about 23 gigabytes for the file size. Now, the next step is to open the Epic Games launcher, and we downloaded it already, so you shouldn't have to do that again. And you click the open launcher. And just like that, you install Twinmotion and you're able to use it. Use everything that you've learned in this video and start applying it now. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and welcome to the grind.